So, Your Holiness, it's a great honor to be here. But as you have just heard, I am speaking on behalf of Professor Harrington, my wife. So she produced this talk. If anything in the talk seems wrong, it is my fault, not hers.
I thought it was.
So blame the messenger in this case, please. So you
tricked him.
So the task which Anne was asked to take on, and which I will now undertake, is to summarize how Western science has tried to deal with the mind really since the beginning of Western science. So, as we say on the slide, this is a very simple introduction to a very large set of issues. And I'm going to talk as a historian, and we will go very swiftly through time. There will be many risky generalizations, but I hope it will be useful, and it will, I think, touch on many themes that have already been raised, especially your comments about various kinds of materialism, older ones and newer ones. So I think the place that we want to begin this story is to understand modern Western science, which really grew up in the 16th and 17th centuries, as a project to understand material reality. And I think it is perhaps important to understand the extent to which that was a self-conscious decision by the leaders of early modern science. They knew what they were doing. They inherited ideas about the world from older Western sources, which combined what we would call mental and subjective ideas with what we would call physical and objective ideas in quite complex ways. This is true of the Greeks. It was true in what's called the medieval period of the Western world. And one of the key things that marks the emergence of modern science is a decision to stop doing that, to stop mixing ideas to do with the mind and ideas to do with matter, and instead to try to focus just on the material world and on things about the material world that could be measured. We've already heard reference to measurement and its importance. And so the kinds of things that early modern scientists were interested in were many. I mean, we've put up a few illustrations here, rocks and lightning and plants and animals understood as physical objects, stars and planets. Arthur has just referred to some of these. Even the human body. There's a famous experiment being shown at the bottom left of this slide, an experiment undertaken by an English physiologist called William Harvey. He did the experiment on his own arm to try to demonstrate that the blood moves in a circle through the body, through the heart. And it's an experiment that you can do on yourself. Anyone can do. It shows actually that the blood only moves one way in the veins. And it always moves in the veins from further away from the heart to closer. It's always going this way, never goes that way. And Harvey asked a brilliant question. If the blood in the veins is always going this way, where did it come from? How did it get into my arm in order to come back in the veins? And although he could not see it, he concluded that there was only one way the blood could get out into the arm or the leg. It must go in the arteries and get between the arteries and the veins. You cannot see any connections between arteries and veins in a human body or in any animal. The connections are too small to see. So as Jinpo was explaining, Harvey makes a hypothesis, he makes a theory that there must be connections between arteries and veins, otherwise the veins would all be empty, and they are not empty. So he infers the existence of a circulation by simple experiments on himself, but he is treating himself for this purpose as a purely physical object. And it's often been noticed that his primary theory, for which he's most famous, is the idea that our heart is a pump, which is a mechanical idea. He takes this idea from engineers and applies it to himself and comes up with a completely new way of thinking about this central organ. So I want to suggest that this is characteristic of early modern science. And as we've seen, I don't need to dwell on this, the early modern scientists extended our understanding of the material world by extending their senses. So here is another picture of Galileo's telescope. I want to, because I'm trained in biology, I have a bias. So let us look instead at the left-hand side of the screen where we see a Dutch biologist, if you will, a man with an almost unpronounceable name in English, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who is the first person to use lenses to identify microscopic animals in water, things he called animalcules. And you see him at work top left. And then at the bottom left, you see a drawing of a flea made by the English natural philosopher Robert Hooke. Again, you can hardly see a flea with your naked eye, but through a microscope, it's a gigantic thing, and that is Hooke's. So there is immense curiosity here among these early modern scientists in all aspects of the physical world. But I just could not resist, we could not resist putting up a couple of images of the work of Isaac Newton, perhaps the most famous of the natural philosophers of early modern science. And it's just another illustration of using techniques to analyze the material world in new ways. And so he, among other things, among many other things, is famous for having used a prism, a piece of glass shaped as a wedge, to examine the nature of white light, sunlight. And he showed convincingly for the first time that white light is a compound, it's a mixture of lights of different colors. And he was able to recombine the rainbow colors to make white light again. So by the time we get to Newton, who is doing this work in the late 17th century, the new science is becoming quite self-confident because so many new discoveries are being made using these new techniques. But this all raises the question that we really want to focus on here, which is, in the middle of all this, where did investigations of the mind fit in? After all, we're getting better and better at understanding the physical world, but what about the mind? And by the way, this illustration is just to illustrate, this is actually a medieval illustration of one medieval theory of the mind, which held that in the brain, the spaces, which are called ventricles, which are filled with fluid, are the most important things. And you see 3 ventricles there, which are believed at that time to have been significant, not least with respect to the location of the soul, the immaterial, immortal part of people in medieval Christian thinking. So what is the answer to this question? The most famous answer to the question, where does the mind fit in for early modern science, is honestly nowhere. It sounds a puzzle, but that's the most common thing one could say. Mind doesn't fit in because it doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing as the material world that we're becoming better at understanding.
Solon is wondering, this is more of a historical question, when people are talking about things like nowhere. So are they thinking, are their conception of mind that they're looking for, is it still tinged with the conception of soul, which is a kind of a theological
yes.
element?
I'm sorry.
Usually, we feel, I see, I saw. So, consciousness and I,
Identical. Identical.
No, where's this mind consciousness going on, soul's going on.
So His Holiness is wondering, when, say, for example, people concluded it's nowhere, are they thinking still in theological terms of the notion of soul, mind as a soul?
Many are. There are complex ideas. There's no single idea, but many people have a theological way of thinking about this, and the concept of the soul is very important. And it's also important for the thinker on this screen, who is the famous French natural philosopher and philosopher René Descartes. And Descartes is the philosopher who is very much part of the... So Descartes is famous for many things. He was an advocate of the new understanding of the physical world, and particularly for a kind of mechanical philosophy. And I will illustrate that in a moment. But Descartes wanted to remove completely from the study of the mechanical physical world any consideration of the mind or the soul. And he does this explicitly so that we can at least understand him, because he's very clear. And he says basically the world is made of two different things, two different substances. There is the material world, which is now the province of what we call science, and there is the immaterial world of mind or soul, which has none of the same properties, and which is the province of something other than science. And this famous concept is often referred to as dualism, because it holds these two things so far apart. So this is not the only idea. I don't want to imply that Descartes' idea is agreed with by everybody. It is not, but it's a very influential idea. And it does, it becomes one radical response to the question, where does mind fit in? And the answer for Descartes is, well, it's a mystery, but mind only fits in very particular ways in human beings, because we have minds and we have physical bodies. So somewhere in us, somehow, these two things relate, but apart from that, they don't relate at all. Now,
he gives a specific place for where
he does. I'm coming to that. He does. Now, you just referred, Your Holiness, to the idea of the soul, and it is worth saying that Descartes' idea that the world of consciousness, mind, and spirit were separate, for some people this was, if you will, a comfort. It was reassuring for religiously oriented people who could say, well, then our traditional beliefs about human spirit, about human immortality, they are to do with this world of mind and spirit. And we can now accept everything coming from science, which is just only confined to dealing with the physical world. This image is taken from a Scottish gravestone, and it's only there because it shows an image of the soul of the deceased person rising to heaven. So the wings and the head are the wings of the immaterial soul after death rising to heaven. So if you were a Cartesian, you could say, well, that's the spiritual side of the person. Their physical nature has died and is in the ground.
Let it.
And this, I do want to emphasize, this is a very radical view. So, as Christoph has just indicated, Descartes thought hard about how the physical human body works. He's showing here on the left a diagram of what might be happening if you put your hand or your foot near a fire and you withdraw. And for him, that impulse is an automatic mechanical thing. It's purely physical. And he even shows on the diagram how it might work in terms for him of the flow of fluids through nerves to muscles, which might somehow cause the muscles to change shape. But you'll see that this all connects up into the head, and it connects up at a place known as the pineal gland, where Descartes thought the immaterial spirit finally made contact with the physical body. And one of the reasons he focused on the pineal gland, he might just as well perhaps have focused on the amygdala, I don't know. But he focused on the pineal gland because it's a single gland where much of the brain is in two. And for Descartes, the spirit is not extended in space. It has no extension. So it can't be divided in two. So the soul could not connect through any of the duplicated structures of the brain. It must connect in one single place, and he chose the pineal gland. I want to emphasize this means that for Descartes, humans are fundamentally distinct from other animals, because for Descartes, all other animals are simply living machines. They have no soul, and so on the right, you see his a kind of diagram to illustrate how we are to think of a duck. And it's not that he thought a duck looked like that, but he thought a duck should in principle be understood like that it's a series of machinery connected together. The duck is thought to have no consciousness. It is not, for Descartes, a sentient being. Only humans are sentient. Voltaire, later in the 18th century, would ridicule Descartes by saying, so we are to believe that throughout the entire universe and the entire world of animals, they're all simple machines, but just we, 5-foot-high human beings walking around, are somehow endowed with a completely different nature. And for Voltaire, this was absurd. So this emphasizes not everybody agreed with Descartes, but this was Descartes' view. And he took a similar approach to some of the issues we have been discussing even today. For example, thinking about vision. For Descartes, vision as a purely, what we would call physiological process, is purely mechanical. It's only when we come to bring our conscious minds to what we see that we can even think about consciousness. So you see a set of diagrams illustrating how the eyes receive an image for Descartes, and how that might be reflected in movements of the hand to point to the image. But only if this is a conscious perception will the pineal gland be involved, at which consciousness is inserted. Now, I have said enough about Descartes, especially since my time is running out. The question is, what effect did he have? And Anne's thesis here for us to think about is that although people did not necessarily agree with Descartes, what he did was to push the problem of studying the mind scientifically into the background. So that for 150 years, it's possible to say, well, we get on with our natural philosophy and study the material world, and the mind is something different, and we don't know what to do about that. So, in a certain sense, and a number of historians have written about this, you can argue, I think, historically, that some of the success of modern science in the early period, by which I mean anywhere between 1600 and 1800, is bought at the price of putting the mind aside and saying, that's a separate set of problems. Let's deal with that later. And it's only really in the 19th century, much more recently, that this set of questions about the mind start to come back, because for all sorts of reasons, people argue that we can't ignore it, and we don't really buy Descartes' view that the mind is completely separate. There were many reasons, I don't have time to describe them, why Descartes' ideas became less plausible, but they were always problematic. I mean, the biggest problem Descartes had, I think, was to explain how two fundamentally different substances could interact. How could this immaterial, unextended, immortal substance, the mind, have any possible influence on this extended material core body? And yet it's clear that it does, and he never said anything remotely convincing about how these two things connect. That was always a problem. But in the 19th century, there are many other problems arising. One of them is that ideas of evolution are beginning to arise, in which, for example, more people are coming to believe that animals and humans may be related, that they may be our literal relatives, in which case it's even more surprising that we have a whole element of our existence which is completely unrelated to them. So in the 19th century, the problem that Descartes had solved with dualism comes back to be addressed in a lot of different ways. And because I only have a few minutes, I'm going to summarize those very briefly. First, it is worth saying that some of the attempts in the 19th century to understand the mind scientifically now drew on methods of introspection, which today we associate much more closely with, for example, the Buddhist tradition. So there was a whole school of introspective psychology in the 19th century, associated particularly with a German psychologist called Wilhelm Wundt. And he tried to apply the same technique of classification and being precise to the study of conscious perceptions that had been so successful in the study of the physical world. So the idea here is that you take something like any visual object. I have an apple here, and you ask the question, what primary conscious percepts might there be associated with looking at the apple? Perhaps its shape, perhaps its color, perhaps its taste or its smell. And he would bring human subjects into a laboratory which looked like a physical science laboratory. It's a very big breakthrough for psychology now to do this. And he would give people perceptual experiences, let them look at an apple, and ask them to report as accurately as possible what their conscious experience was. And he was looking to find a natural classification of conscious elements which went to build up our conscious experience. Wundt himself was unconvinced by what he did. It was very hard to get consistency of reporting between individual subjects, and actually quite quickly introspective psychology was subjected to heavy criticism. That's a picture of a man called J.B. Watson, who founded a much more influential school of behaviorism, which basically said you're going to get nowhere by relying on introspection. We must stick with what we can observe. And so we observe not the conscious mind, but we observe.
시신기 수수로야 잘했지. 딕토네 그게 제도 말했을 때 진남 주고도네 룡하게 죄배도네.
So Watson tries to shift the interest of psychology from introspected states of consciousness to observable behaviors, hence the term behaviorism for his branch of psychology. That is a second major attempt. I won't worry about the quote there. Psychology in the 20th century, experimental psychology, starts to do a great deal by way of setting human subjects various tests and tasks. This is another approach to the scientific study of mind, where you try to break down psychological abilities such as memory and perception, language or attention, into their constituent components by setting tests, which are usually quantitative in nature. And that gets a long way. But as another scientist who has participated in Mind and Life, Steve Koslin, has observed, I won't read the quotation. But Koslin observes that one of the limitations of this style of psychology is that so long as you stick to the identification of psychological functions and how they work, you learn nothing about how they are represented in the brain. And so there has been a shift increasingly in recent decades to trying to finally get back to that physical structure, the brain, and analyze, as you've been hearing from other colleagues, how that supports mental life and particularly conscious experience. So I don't need to describe this. I think you know about this kind of work. This is an illustration of a much larger field, or maybe several larger fields of modern brain science, which use imaging, among other things, to try to, or recording of mental activity, to try to associate particular mental states with particular parts of the brain. There is a long history to that. It goes right back to the observation of the relationship between damage to the brain and changes in brain function. That image on the left there is a very famous one in brain science. It's the image of a subject studied by Pierre Broca, the French neurologist, of a man called Tan who had an inability to speak. And after death, he was found to have a big lesion in his brain, now known as Broca's area. So there's a consistent theme through a great deal of recent brain science, right the way from that work in the 19th century to the latest brain imaging work which is trying to get more and more refined about the relationship between what is going on in people's conscious minds and what is going on in the brain. And others will speak much more to this. I will skip over it in the interests of the next talk. I just want to notice that this is all an attempt to produce a unified account. So the question that is raised by all of these efforts on behalf of modern science is whether after 400 years we are close or not to an ability to relate mental events to brain events in ways that would end this tradition of dualistic thinking. That's a question. Some people think the answer to that question is yes, we are close. This is a famous representative of that view, Patricia Churchland. I won't read the quotation, but she thinks that in the end it will be possible to give a consistent...
California,
yes. So this is a tradition that she represents of trying to understand the mind as a function of the human brain, but she knows that many folk disagree that this will be possible. There are people out there who just are skeptical that this will ever be possible on the basis of modern science. And we're still left today in a scientific perspective with what a lot of people call the hard problem, which is why we have the basic subjective experiences that we have. These are things that Anne likes to use to illustrate this hard problem. These are pet rocks, which apparently are sold. And of course, it's an absurd idea to have a pet rock, because you can't really have a relationship with a rock, because it doesn't seem to be a sentient being. And, and even putting little false eyes on them doesn't make them sentient beings, really. There's a philosopher in America who likes to talk about the problem of sentience by asking the question, what is it like to be that? And with a rock, I think we would probably all agree it's not like anything to be a rock. You don't have any inner life that would allow you to say, to be a rock is a bit like being this or that. We probably do have good reason to think that it is like something to be a bat or a bird, and actually Nagel wrote a famous article about the bat to illustrate this argument. And it's still an open question in Western science whether the techniques we are using are going to end up enabling us to crack the problem of why it is like something to be a sentient being. That is still an open question in Western science. Thank you.
So, first, most basically, what is neuroscience? What are neuroscientists interested in studying? And at a basic level, it is the study of the nervous system in our bodies. So the nervous system includes the brain, which of course is what you hear most talked about. It also includes the spinal cord, which comes out of the base of the brain through your spine and is connected through many, many nerves throughout your entire body. So your brain is actually connected throughout your entire body. And the nervous system performs many extremely important essential functions for our lives. It helps to maintain our own bodies, so all the regulatory systems, breathing, heartbeat, digestion, fighting disease, all these things that we don't often think about are controlled by the nervous system. It also allows us to operate within our environment, so that includes taking in information through our 5 senses about the environment around us, and then responding through behavior or other actions, motor actions, other behaviors. And in higher animals, such as humans, the brain also is what underlies our thoughts and feelings, emotions, complex processes like that. So obviously, the nervous system is an extremely important system for us to understand, and John spoke a little bit about why scientists believe that the brain is the main organ of the mind. So just to give some very basic information, a little bit of a tour of the brain for anyone who is not used to looking at it. The outer wrinkly part of the brain is called the cortex. Sorry, just hear me? It's okay? And the cortex is commonly divided into 4 different sections called lobes. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Sorry. So the brain is divided commonly into 4 different sections called lobes. And there are many different functions associated with these regions. The frontal lobe is associated with motor control, motor action, and also a lot of higher cognitive functions such as evaluation, decision-making, also regulation of our attention, language processes. And Richie this morning was talking about the prefrontal cortex, the most frontal region of the brain, and he was relating that to our ability to engage in mental time travel, so thinking of the future, thinking of the past. All of these higher cognitive functions happen in this frontal region of the brain. Behind the frontal lobe is what we call the parietal lobe, and this is involved in our sense of touch perception, and also integrating a lot of sensory information from other senses. On the sides of the brain are referred to as the temporal lobe. This is involved in processing our sense of smell and our hearing sense of sound, and also some visual systems of processing specific information like faces and scenes. And at the back of the brain is what we call the occipital lobe, which is primarily devoted to vision. It's a very important sense for humans. There's a lot of the brain devoted to it. Underneath this large outer cortex is called the cerebellum. This is a specialized region that's involved in regulating your balance and coordination of movements. And it's also recently been understood to also be really involved in attention processes. And again, we see the spinal cord coming out of the base of the brain, which serves as the connection from the brain to the entire body.
So His Holiness is aware of the fact that it has been discovered that even though certain regions of or parts of the brain is damaged, over time, the specific functions of those damaged damaged part of the brain can be taken over by other regions. So with relation to, for example, speech, so if the speech part of the brain is damaged, and are there any specific areas which are correlated so that function of that could be taken over by another specific brain area, or is it
particular area or overall?
Or is it just an overall remedial process?
Well, you don't have a mic.
I think on the age at which it happens. If it happens very early, like in childhood, there's some children where they have a tumor and the tumor is removed from the language hemisphere and they stop talking, but within a few months they can start talking again because they can transfer the language processing from the left to the right. But if this would happen in me, at my age, I would not be able to recover speech. If I had a stroke here, if it's big enough, I would be left aphasic. I could not talk again.
So my point is that 게 가서다 샤야 그게 마주 샤야 가나 레벨 초디 견 쇼도 전에 다디 근섭 생각이 레벨 초 디네 내신 딱 비네 연구를 해야 연하면요. 초신다 지네.
His Holiness
레벨 근섭 시기도 시샤샤.
So His Holiness' question is the following: that the fact that there is such a phenomenon is uncontroversial. But the point he's asking is, are there determinate sites which can take over the functions of specific damaged, specific parts of the brain?
Clarification. See, another sort of part damage. Then, not the area which
To kind of recover. No.
or damage.
So His Holiness is wondering whether are there, for example, if someone loses language as a result of damage to that language part of the brain, is it always the case that there is a specific part of the brain that can take over that function?
No.
There could be multiple parts of the brain that could take over. So there's not a specific part of the brain that will always take over. It's also the case, Your Holiness, that in my opinion, and there may be some differences among scientists here, but there have been very few tests of the further limits of human plasticity. And to give one specific example, there is a very important study that was done a number of years ago with patients who had a stroke where half the body was paralyzed because of damage to one side. And they treated these patients by putting the side of the body that was paralyzed in a whole body cast. So they immobilized the side of the body that was healthy. and they immobilized it for 16 weeks. So they lived in a cast 24 hours a day for 16 weeks. And what they found is that there was dramatic improvements on the other impaired side that they hadn't seen before because the other side was, the brain was forced to rewire in a way which conventional treatments had not yet achieved. And so I think that this study raises the question about the limits of plasticity and what may be possible.
그래도 네버 요 말이스. 근데 사장님이 최고장님이 아니 주유는 이해를 대체는 유행 고부잡도 그러와. 다 고부잡으로 맞춘. 플라스터나 샤제. 다 둔다 주두를 갈래다는. 라바리에다 강바예도 배주처럼 맞춘 샤한두가 아니 레벨이야 다 나오면 봐. 수수 레벨 냠세 차시 코로나를 소조자고 년시. 랑슈자고 년시한두가 녜마 맞춤부터 중요했어. 딘자 레벨 차시지 냠배경기. So does that mean that, say, for example, like the functions like mobility came to be restored to a point?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So Dr. Doty is a neurosurgeon, so he operates on the brain.
So it's interesting. What I would comment on is, in part, it is due to the injury itself, and in part, it has to do with the ability of the person. You can see individuals, an example, who have a stroke in their speech area who do not ever get it back. You see people, though, who extend an immense amount of focus and effort and can have dramatic improvement. I think the other thing you see, which Tanya and I were just chatting about, are individuals who are blind, yet you look at what is nominally their area for hearing, and it gets much bigger. So there is this capacity.
미샤라 차두가라 되게 암조 고야레베 숙체로 고야찬 또 왕시에그 누가 바표에서 그렇지. 근데 용거라서 근데 미끼를 소소도네 맨날 개발시라도 듬버 숙체 중다.
We'll just run over a little bit.
저서 달래베 네 야제 자다 뭐 지랑
예전에도 no.
The
So
other
does that
aspect,
mean that the localization of the functions of different brain regions are not that determinate, not that definite? So in that sense, when we talk about these different parts of the brain in functional terms, we cannot speak in absolute terms.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
So
yeah.
once again, Your Holiness, you have 5 neuroscientists scratching their heads, wondering how to answer your question. So another good question, but we must give the floor back to our speaker.
well, what I would just say is that we do know that there are fairly specific areas in the brain that are associated with function, but they are not absolute. There is variability. As an example, a person could have a stroke in what would traditionally be expected to cause aphasia or inability to speak, but in fact it does not do that at all. And what we see when we look at functional imaging is that their speech area is actually a little bit away from where we would have predicted. So there is this area of variability. The other interesting thing that we are now exploring is a of neuroprosthetics. We can actually put electrodes on the surface of the brain and teach individuals how to independently move objects, if you will, using computers that are connected to this brain interface. So there are some extraordinary possibilities there in the future, but as I think Dr. Davidson had pointed out earlier, based on the complexity of the brain, we are mere infants in our understanding of the brain function itself.
다대잘 시바 범시에 마도 요마레스 레번 요로 사부시르와 레번 대뇨도 사부시부진데 걸 다대잘 시바 마제 범시에서 좀 마도 나 이네 내가 셀이야 잡아 So although it may be a bit silly question, So although it may be a little bit of a silly question, but we were talking about restoration of speech in individuals whose speech sites are damaged. what if, theoretically speaking, if we just completely take it out? I mean, is there No, the individual.
brain can
So can the speech be recovered?
It would depend on the age and many factors.
Yeah.
지구자 그래서.
Small or big.
Yeah.
저 니가 꼬마고다. 근데 그 게임이 장사들 레버 예체 유엔디 수수 밖에 막게 해들어. 밖에 해들어. 딘전 딘데 돈에 야 초니가 꼬는 마도 초지 꼬는 야 골레베 신다데 제도로. 근데 개반도 그래서도. 아니 체중 꼬마고다. 아니 로 체중다.
One thing we know for sure is that part of the brain would not begin to speak.
대단한데 꼬베는 견쇼서게 레버디 자식 돈에 계시에 두 말했어. 다들랍 두랬어.
딱 콜레는 그냥 돈 먹고요.
나래.
돈 먹고요. 돈 붙이는 견셔리는.
나래.
양 콜레 야도
나래. So even there, so even there, the speech site must be a very complex site with a lot of different networks. So you can have a damage in one part, as opposed to having the whole thing removed.
Yes.
예윤이가 열어봐. 예를 꼽이나. So what if both? So what theoretically speaking, what if you take both sides out? Then you can't.
More problem.
In general, if both
Worse
parts of the brain are removed on both sides, in general, you are much less likely to recover function than if it's only unilateral.
네, 가버렸을 나. 전이가 거나. 나래. So you need some basis. Yeah. Right.
자상가 콜레버 견셔를 되게 function 지기도 와.
나래. So in a sense, even though that this individual has a damaged brain, but even the damaged part is doing some function. 그렇죠.
Something like become weaker, so you need some sort of cooperation.
Support, yeah.
Yeah. And it's
Basically, that damaged part still
Working
some
on
sort of
some function.
It depends on the damage. Yeah.
네,
And it's
약간
oftentimes the surrounding tissue that
너무
will
집중을 하려고
take over
해서
the function.